Hey everyone, welcome back to Be Not Afraid, a podcast that lifts the voices of dissidents. Today I have a brilliant guest, Jaco Van Zyl, who is a clinical psychologist, and we talk about what's going on in psychology and also the antidotes, which is his group, Critical Therapy Antidote. And I think you'll just really enjoy this conversation, and be sure to follow their group after you listen. Thanks, and remember to subscribe. Welcome, Jaco. What made you decide to become a clinical psychologist?
From an early age, I was always curious as to, always tried to figure out what was going on in the person's mind. I was parentified as a child as well because of the situation at home. So, like I said, from a small age, I was interested in the human mind. I was interested in figuring myself out. I became aware from a very young age that I feel differently as well because I'm gay. And in psychoanalytic terms, I would, my homosexuality would be classified as early onset homosexuality. So I grappled with that. I grappled with the meaning of life. I grappled with religion. I was quite religious as a child. So these were the type of themes that were flowing around in my mind, discussions that I would have, thoughts I would think. I would oftentimes get into trouble for expressing thoughts that were not necessarily acceptable or welcome in a very religious community. So at an early age, even, I got into trouble with my ideas around church. But it must have been around my high school years when a friend of mine told me that her father used to study psychology, and I was interested in borrowing a psychology textbook from her. And it was in my high school years that I started to read psychology. But I had struggles of my own, struggles that I had to figure out myself, and it took a few years of psychotherapy for me to adequately resolve some of my issues. But it was toward the end of my 20s that I decided to formalize my knowledge of psychology when I enrolled for a course, a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology and Linguistics, and then also my master's degree in my early 30s. So it has been the plane on which I operated from a very early age. People fascinate me. History fascinates me. Well, science too. Science is a product of human endeavor and curiosity and discovery. So from a very early age, I was interested in psychology, and I got lucky. I was very, very happy to have been selected and to formalize my training and also my postgraduate training in clinical psychology in South Africa.
So you did actually see a psychologist yourself growing up?
Yeah. Yes.
And you said that you were able to resolve some of your issues. It seems to me therapy in all of its different forms has changed its objective of trying to resolve issues and instead change the person. How is that happening?
Let me approach it from this angle. When we get born as infants, we encounter frustrations. We encounter delay of gratification. The response to that frustration is usually a bodily response. It's intense. We want to get rid of the source of frustration. We want to evacuate our internal distress. We want to get rid of the thing that prevents us from getting our wishes fulfilled. And throughout the course of our development, we start adopting sometimes well-adapted, but oftentimes maladaptive coping mechanisms that are not necessarily adequate to deal with the frustration in such a way that we flourish while encountering this restriction in wish fulfillment or in desire fulfillment. We are not that important. So psychotherapy, to a large extent, is a process by which we willingly allow ourselves to be stripped of maladaptive narcissistic patterns. We're not the center of the universe. My conclusions, my subjective experiences are not necessarily universally accurate. and that it is okay. I will survive it. I can even flourish within those restrictions. And that is the type of maturity and the type of internal relationship one starts to build with oneself, in managing these distresses, in self-soothing in appropriate ways. It is a process of mourning. That's part of it. It's a painful process. Like I said, right from the beginning, when we get born, we start losing stuff. We've lost the comfort of a safe and warm and ever-ready womb. And then we get born into a world that is cold, where mother is not always on time in fulfilling our wishes and desires, where my will isn't always responded to as promptly as I would want to. And to realize that is a process of, is a realization of loss. And to mourn that loss and to find ways of coping in spite of that loss is the ultimate aim of human maturity, of growing into maturity. And we only approach maturity. There's never a destination where we can say, I'm now finally healed and mature. No, that's not how it works. We always approximate greater insight into ourselves, and it's like the layers of an onion. That is there is always work to do in this self-discovery and stripping the self lovingly of our narcissism and finding ways of flourishing in spite of those restrictions.
So this is time tested. This has been going on.
Absolutely.
People have known these things for
decades.
Right. Maybe even centuries, right?
Well, yeah, if you're a Jungian and you appreciate some of the traditional forms of therapy, of rituals that we find in various different cultures, we see that this would be time-tested processes that have accumulated over centuries, that have been coded in myths and mythological stories. Myths and mythological stories captured in the collective unconscious, and stories that have featured across continents, across millennia, time-tested. And one prominent story would be, well, the Adam and Eve story is one prominent story, where again we get expelled. It feels like we're being expelled out of Eden. It is a harsh environment where we have to work to earn our keep.
Right.
And in spite of these restrictions, to find our way ultimately back into Eden, where the instruction is that you have to eat your ego. You have to strip yourself of your ego, of these masks and maladaptive ways of coping, so as to approach the state of oneness, the state of bliss in spite of these restrictions.
So what is going on that it seems it's exactly the opposite? It seems like especially our children are being taught to embrace the ego, embrace the self. Nothing else matters except for how they feel. And it's, to me, looking at it as just a layman, I feel like, I guess I should say layperson, I feel like it's about weakening our culture, or really even breaking our children, because there's all of these time-tested things that we've known that you want. The goal for a human being is to move towards a place of maturity, to move towards a place where you can do difficult things and embrace the fact that it's difficult and then mature. But what's going on in therapy that's changing that?
What we see is an excessive focus on the environment as a reason for distress. And that the environment is ultimately essentially corrupt. That certain people and certain categories of people populate that environment. And that part of the now critical social justice informed psychotherapy or wokeified psychotherapy would be to create a kind of critical consciousness. Just be aware of these structures of oppression, these systems of population occupation, where people are split between oppressor and oppressed categories. And like you said, that the self is elevated, subjective experience is elevated. When we started, it's not part of the recording now, you made mention of my accent. And to them, to some people, that would count as a microaggression, whereas your intentions were pure. But if you said that to someone who had critical consciousness, who themselves have endorsed wokeism, that comment would have registered as a microaggression in spite of your intention. So the person's subjective experience is primary, and that is this system of wokeification, of turning psychotherapy into something that has been heavily influenced by this critical social justice ideology, is a narcissogenic. It is a system by which narcissism is cultivated and generated, where the self is superior. And if something makes me feel uncomfortable, instead of engaging the thing that makes me feel uncomfortable, instead of finding ways of coping, of understanding myself, understanding why it necessarily makes me feel uncomfortable, instead of finding ways of even, like I said, flourishing in spite of the thing that makes me uncomfortable, I condemn that thing as oppressive and harmful. And I respond destructively toward that thing that restricts my will. So it's an envious process. In psychoanalysis, we call this an envious process. We consider the external restriction of my will as more powerful. It is power I would like to have. I do not have it. So I destroy the thing that is more powerful than I am, so that neither of us would be powerful. At the very basic. And if, on the other hand, I can conquer that and I can exert my power over it, even better. And so that would be the raw formulation. This enviously destructive response against what restricts my will. And now, to get that established as something to be sought after, something that is regarded as good, I need to moralize that. And I moralize that by declaring it as something I am entitled to. And as a victim, as something as someone that has been stripped of something I am entitled to, now my retaliation is justified. We see this justification of destruction around the world, where communities have endorsed this critical social justice ideology.
But it seems like if you are on the bottom and you are pushing to make it sure that your will and the things that you're entitled to put you on the top, then when you're on the top, somebody else is going to come along who's on the bottom, and it's a never-ending spiral, right? That wheel would never stop. Mm-hmm. You don't get to a point of actual unity. You don't get to a point of actual healing, because somebody is always striving to be the next person on top. I hear so many things about, especially with critical race theory, and they were slave masters, we were slaves. But when I hear the vileness and the hatred, that's what I hear when some of these people talk. And I think, you are no more gracious or no more benevolent than the people that you're pushing down. Like, it seems to me that if you had the chance to have that kind of power, you would take it and you would crush others with it.
But that's what in philosophy you call it performative contradiction. If they truly believed in what they said, they wouldn't have practiced it themselves. And they do that shamelessly. I mean, without any scruples. So maybe I can respond to that a bit.
Yes.
And what we discuss is well-established concepts in psychology, which makes it so much more unthinkable why psychologists would endorse something that would be so clearly in violation of well-established models and theories in social psychology and psychoanalysis. In social psychology, we have this concept of social identity model and the steps to collective violence, or the development of collective violence. And it would follow 5 steps. The first step would be identity formation. Now, identity formation is just fine. We all have in-group preferences. There might even be cooperation among in-groups, banter among groups. Some of those jokes that we might tell about different groups might be considered politically incorrect, but it's done in good spirit. All right, so the discourse within which that takes place would be a discourse of mutual respect and understanding, a common humanity type discourse. So there would be identity formation. The trouble comes in when that identity formation starts to deteriorate, in that identities are being split into in-groups and out-groups, where the out-group is considered to be a potential threat and the in-group is threatened. And that then would lead to justification of violent retaliation. But that violent retaliation would be justified by virtue of the presence of a perceived threat. And then ultimately there would be celebration of that retaliation and the overpowering of the demonized other. So that is from a social psychological perspective.
And we saw this in, I don't know if you are aware of the riots that happened a couple of years ago here in the States, but in Portland, there was one person who was shot, just shot in the head during a protest or a counter protest. And when they announced that he was shot, the group stood up and cheered. Young people standing up and cheering. And isn't this Herbert Marcuse? He's
repressive tolerance. Yeah, yes. Repressive tolerance, and he encouraged this kind of toppling and subversive protesting. Absolutely. So there is also performative contradiction. So Herbert Marcuse was a Marxist, but he was also a psychoanalyst, and he was part of the Frankfurt School. And him and his colleagues were disillusioned by the failure of traditional Marxism, and they were very much aware of inequality that they saw around them. And we may all affirm that there might be inequality around us. But what about the solution? So because they were Marxists, they were bent on using Marxism as the solution to the inequality they saw around them. And one of the problems he had was what he called the repressive tolerance of a capitalistic system. The solution he proposed was repressive tolerance, that certain things were regarded as too dangerous to disseminate or to communicate, and for the sake of the greater good of the population, that had to be repressed. And to him, he was a psychoanalyst, and he had such an idealized view of the people in power, as if their judgment of what would be tolerant and not, what would be acceptable or not, would somehow be perfect. The fantastical conjuring up of bizarre ideas have no end when you start reading these theoreticians. I do want to touch on what you also said about history. So from a psychoanalytic perspective, so I gave you a perspective from a social psychological model. So let me elaborate a bit on the psychoanalytic perspective. So the psychoanalytic perspective of what we're describing here is what we call large group conflict or regressive large group narcissism. The person who's actually the expert in this is a Cypriot. His name is Vamik Volkan, and he wrote a lot about it, where he conceptualized this phenomenon of large group formation, first of all, as the first step. And again, large group formation would be fine. The bantering can happen. We take it as a joke. We're adults among adults. By the way, Sigmund Freud called this the narcissism of minor differences. It is just fine. It's harmless. We can take jokes. But what then happens is, due to trauma, due to certain incidents, the way certain incidents are represented in the minds of the collective, and here it's very, very important, due to instigation. Now, this instigation can be from activists, from terrorists, from political organizations, even from the exploitation of group vulnerabilities through ideology. So religion can play a role, and in this case, also critical social justice or wokeism can play a role. Resentment is flamed. And from this resentment, then people would usually then hark back to historical incidents where something similar must have happened. And this is the symbolic expression of historical trauma then. Now, the processing of historical trauma is just fine. Jews do that in their rituals. Some other communities do that too, where defeat, conquer, where successes, achievements are celebrated in ritual. But if that ritual takes place within, again, the discourse, within a discourse of resentment and resentment building, what we're building here is polarization. It is along identity lines, group identity lines. And group identity is something that is flexible. It moves around. It's something that is largely, to some extent, socially constructed. Something that then happens when something traumatic takes place is what Vamik Volkan calls time collapse. We remember something similar that happened in history. We feel that what happened in history is now represented in our current experience. In history, there were also enemies. Who represents the enemy group now? That population group. In history, we were defeated. Now we need to retaliate. We need to defeat those who serve as tokens, those who serve as representations of the historical villain.
And that's where we get rid of the idea of gratitude. We get rid of the fact that there were people who fought, even in this tokenized group, there were people who fought together to stop whatever the atrocities were. And we forget them, because I call it critical resentment theory instead of critical resentment theory. Because we're really teaching people to live in a constant state of resentment and a constant state of victimhood and a constant state of, it feels like just hatred.
Yes.
Hate the people who aren't like you.
Right. And this is elevated as something honorable. It is something that is encouraged. Develop your critical consciousness. If you give the enemy just this bit of gap, just this bit of reasonability, you're perpetuating the oppression, the genocide that's taking place underneath our noses. You're maintaining the status quo. What needs to happen is the demonized other, first of all, needs to be declared as essentially flawed. Essentially, that is very, very important. So historically, for instance, in Rwanda, 1994, which is an interesting date to South Africa. 1994 was when South Africa became a constitutional democracy, moving out of the previous regime of apartheid. But that was also the year when the genocide in Rwanda broke out. And The Hutus depicted the Tutsis as cockroaches. So we see the dehumanization, the declaring of the other as essentially flawed, which helps to undermine these scruples that people would otherwise have had. It's not nice to be violent toward the other person. There are natural scruples against being violent. But to weaken those scruples, you need to dehumanize the other. And that is what we see with this demonization, this essential demonization of the other. And we see that also in critical social justice language, when they condemn not racial superiority, which is a neutral term, which allows any race the possibility of being classified as such, should they exhibit these characteristics worthy of that classification. That's not what they do. They declare only one group as racially superior by using essentializing language, namely whiteness. And that language is deliberate, because these people are students of linguistics and of language. They know, even though they might say theoretically, we're not necessarily demonizing humans as such, as much as we're demonizing mental superiority or an attitude of racial superiority among those people of the particular race. But when you listen to them, they describe humans, they describe white people, or they describe straight men, or they, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So they know at some level it will register in the mind of the masses in essentialized terms anyway. Hitler used the same type of language when he essentialized the Jews and depicted them as swindlers, as rats, and that type of thing.
We had it recently. They called Trump supporters, they call them maggots. So the people in Congress
to rhyme with a
MAGA, right?
Yeah.
So they call them maggots, and nobody questions that. And I look at it going, I mean, it's interesting that you brought up Hitler, because I remember when this all started in the very beginning, and I just thought, this is how Nazis are made.
This follows theory like a textbook example.
So then how come your very well-educated class of people are taking it on? I mean, it seems to me that they would know history better than anyone else. So how come so many are following in these same footsteps? Because you don't have to be a bad person to do bad things. Someone said, all it takes for evil to thrive is for good men to do nothing.
Yeah.
And that's what I see. I'm sitting there going, so many people go to school so that they go to university so that they can get a degree and help people. Like, how do you go from, these are my aims as a therapist, to all of a sudden being told, no, now these are your aims?
Yeah. I think it is necessary to appreciate that this isn't a critical social justice phenomenon. This isn't a far-right phenomenon. This is a human phenomenon. We're all susceptible to this. Radicalization can happen to all of us. If we're not reflective enough, if we do not have a system which endorses an ideology where we can critically reflect, critically in the intellectual way as opposed to in the ideological way, critically reflect around attitudes, if we do not have built into the system mechanisms by which we, like whistleblowing or playing devil's advocate, where we can be held accountable ourselves, then this type of mass formation, this monolithization of the narrative will take place. And certain ideologies will be more susceptible to this, especially ideologies that out of principle condemn critical self-reflection. Like I said, in critical social justice, anything that is not wholly supportive of utter destruction, dismantling of the system now, is considered to be maintaining of the status quo. And that is why even workified organizations, when you bring it under their attention, that men and boys are currently living in a state of crisis, they would immediately consider you as an enemy as opposed to an ally that would be unified in them, with them in condemning the patriarchy, the male privilege and the like. So
what's insane about that is that a lot of times the people at the top, the people that you're they are men. They are often cisgendered, their words, straight white males.
Yeah,
but they're still males. Supporting this. So are
heterosexual biological males? Yeah.
Yes. Now, are they supporting this? Do you think they're supporting this because they believe it, or do you think that they support this because they're afraid?
Okay, so let's think about this systemically. It is very trendy to be woke these days. Let's start there. The early theoreticians, from which current social justice, critical social justice theoreticians have gleaned their ideas, were themselves subversive. So, and for them to adequately subvert this current system that they consider to be irreparably oppressive, they said that we should infiltrate all pillars of society. And pillars of society would include things like politics, media, the church, families, schools as centers of education. And that is what they've done. And because of that, there's this echo chambering that has taken place. And when you hear the single narrative all the time, it is very difficult to think out of those terms. When part of the ideology that you're endorsing is that you better not criticize what we're doing, otherwise you will be demonized like the rest. Let's make examples of some to give you a taste of what's lying ahead of you, should you do the same. And that leads to self-censorship. So I do think some of them believe in that. And that is also what is possible, what is possibly a kind of group narcissistic process that is taking place. Let me explain that. So, like I said, so narcissism is a process in which the self is elevated in defiance of an environment populated by certain people, in which the demand is made that the environment needs to affirm my subjectivity all the time. That is narcissism. There are three types of narcissisms. There's what we call grandiose narcissism, what we call closet narcissism, and then ultimately a third form of narcissism would be devaluing narcissism. So in grandiose narcissism, that is the narcissism that we usually think of when we then we also get male and female type narcissism.
Okay.
Where male narcissism would be way more overt, female narcissism would be a bit more covert, but the self is promoted as supreme. Everybody else needs to line up to what we call engage in the in narcissistic supply. In other words, affirm what the person wants us to affirm all the time. A narcissistic self would expand themselves. We call it the narcissistic expansion of the self to include the environment into their subjectivity. And we call that one-mindedness. And that is why narcissists find it so difficult to bear criticism, because it's such a painful thing. It's a breakage of one-mindedness, or the fused mind. And when there is a breakage of the fusion, the other is devalued, is declared violent, is declared evil, and there's usually what we call narcissistic rage that is acted upon the other that has broken the fusion. So that is what we call grandiose narcissism. Closeted narcissism, or closet narcissism, is narcissism in service of the other. So it's still narcissistic, but it's narcissism by proxy. By virtue of my association with the idealized other, I get narcissistic supply, and I get narcissistic value.
Would this be like Munchausen?
Yes, that is a very good example.
Okay.
Where let me just say this, where grandiose narcissism, we usually think in terms of achievement, but achievement would be a requirement for grandiose narcissism in typical dignity and honor societies. In dignity and honor societies, where in dignity societies, the inherent dignity of the other person is assumed, and the person would have great achievements, and within those societies, a person could demand narcissistic supply. But in a victimhood society, victimhood status is elevated as something sought after. So just because someone is a victim, and in an honest society, one would think, who wants to be a victim? It depends on which society you find yourself. If victimhood is prioritized as something honorable and something morally idealized and essentialized, then that could be something on the basis of which a person could demand narcissistic supply. So with closet narcissism, like I said, the other is idealized, and by virtue of my identification with the other, I get my value. So many people who come across as servile and loyal and committed, and these die-hard, I'm not saying all of them are like that, I'm just using generalized examples of this. These die-hard loyalists who strive for the success of a company. So their identification with this company and the success of the company, by virtue of that identification, they get narcissistic satisfaction. We also see this in some forms of parenthood, where the child might be the little achiever, and by virtue of that parent's boosting of the child and the child's achievement, that parent gets narcissistic supply. And then the third form of narcissism is, and this is possibly the most pathological form of narcissism, where fusion is simultaneously desired and feared. So it's usually someone who's grown up with severely disrupted and traumatized attachment patterns, where fusion is simultaneously desired and feared. And these would be people that would go around being very resentful, whom you'd find very difficult to build bonds with, who would be very, very, very paranoid and suspicious, and who would approach and then also expel or distance themselves or anticipate rejection. Before they get rejected, they would do the rejecting. So that is what we call devaluing narcissists. We bring this together in terms of groups.
Okay.
What do we find us? What do we see around us these days? We see groups of people identity obsessed within the critical social justice ideology. And within that system, certain people belong to the victimized groups. And those groups, those who've endorsed this ideology, they demand their narcissistic supply. And you dare not speak against them. You dare not criticize them, because they respond with narcissistic rage if you dare do that. If you dare break that fusion. They can only be as powerful thanks to people who offer them that power. And that is where the closet narcissistic group comes in, where this group might not occupy these identity positions that are coveted or sought after, the victimhood identity positions, but these would be the so-called allies. the straight white men or white women, right? And these are the rescuers. There's a derogatory term these days that they call, these white saviors. And these people rush to the rescue of these grandiose narcissists, these victimized, resentful groups. And by virtue of their rescuing, of their elevating, of their promoting, they feel so morally fulfilled, right?
Yeah.
But then you also have these activist groups who really do not want to be understood, who really do not want to really attach with society. They are the terrorizers, and they are the ones who riot. They are the ones who dox journalists. They are the ones who would make phone calls to police due to some injury, certain form of speech that was uttered, etc., etc. So they are the devaluing, destructive, the very envious and resentful activist groups, and they usually do this in mobs and riots. Systemically, we see something similar playing out. So you asked me, why are these straight white males promoting DEI? Well, probably because of this closet narcissistic group formation. Maybe because they fear that their employment is on the line should they speak out.
Right.
Yeah. So there could be quite a few explanations for that.
So I really want to know, can people be trained to be narcissists, or is that something that you are born?
That's a good question. So maybe I should also have added that there is well-adaptive and maladaptive narcissism. When you're hungry and you know that you need to prepare yourself some food, you need to pause on, say, tending to the dog or tending to your friend, and you need to prepare some food. You prioritize yourself, right? But that is not a disproportionate self-prioritization. It's quite proportional. You need to survive. So self-survival, or survival of the self, a prioritizing of the self in adequate ways without encroaching on the rights and the well-being of others, that would be considered well-adaptive narcissism. Mm. So we all have this narcissistic, shall we say, instinct within us. Due to character formation, certain people develop what we call narcissistic character structures, and in severe cases, certain people develop narcissistic personality disorder along these three distinctions that I just described. But at a collective level, because we all possess the facility of narcissism, at a collective level, we can also regress into what I referred to earlier as regressive large group narcissism, where we endorse and buy into a collective identity to such an extent that this leads into tribalism. We demonize the other. We build resentment. We reach back into history. We try and enact something symbolically through the enactment of historical struggles. That breaks down natural scruples that we otherwise have had, and we find a way of enacting this resentment in the form of discrimination, of prejudice, and even of violence. And in our imagination, we're also thinking that we need to celebrate our victories. And that is how large group regressive narcissism can happen to all of us. It can happen to you and me as well.
Right.
Those of us who do not agree with this ideology of critical social justice, if we do not hold each other and ourselves accountable so as to maintain a common humanity approach as opposed to a common enemy approach, we will fall into the same trap.
Yeah. I try to keep my own story as in the background as possible, but I do feel like the way that I was not raised, because I lived in the foster system and in multiple different homes and that kind of thing, there is an inherent distrust and an inherent you need to prove that you're a good person to me, right?
Absolutely.
And so
that's understandable.
kind of a bit of like, you want to protect yourself.
Absolutely.
So, but then there's a point of wanting to protect yourself where you realize that it could go to unhealthy, like to distrust and to constantly look at people like, you know, you're just after me. You just want to get me all the time. So what I'm wondering, because there has to be, and I know your group is called Critical Therapy Antidote, there has to be an antidote, because the thing that I'm most concerned about in this whole mess, there's so much you could be concerned about, right? But the fact that they want to, I don't know if you know what social and emotional learning is. Have you heard of that?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
I'm not an expert on that. Maybe you can just elaborate on that. Maybe I can just comment.
When I look at social and emotional learning curricula, it is teaching our children that there is one way to think.
That's emotional thinking.
It's teaching our children that there is one way to do good things. One of the things they want to do is by 8th grade, have your children know how to choose a disruptive strategy. They're making Antifa at school, and nobody recognizes it.
That's Paulo Freire.
Exactly. And nobody recognizes it. And it starts off so simple. It starts off, you know, you're in 1st grade and you're reading a story about a puppy puppies that aren't being adopted at the pet shop. So what can you do? Well, you can make signs and you can go to your neighbors and you can encourage them that everyone needs a puppy. And it seems so wonderful and light, right? But when you change the puppy to climate change, or you change the puppy to racial injustice, you start teaching these kids there is only one way. There's only one law that you need to follow. And also on top of that is that despite the fact that there are so many kids who can't read, especially after the pandemic, there are kids who can't read, there are kids who can't do math, and we are flooding our schools with social workers and school psychologists. And it just seems like we're really focusing on our children's emotional, and that's what it is, social, emotional learning to think through a social and emotional lens. We're turning these babies into narcissists.
Yes. So I can imagine where things can go too far. But again, subjective experience would predominate objective reality, or a negotiation of what actually happened. And where subjective experience and even emotional crowd formation could overpower a necessary intellectual investigation of things that happened. I can also see how people would start focusing so much on the environment as opposed to finding ways in which they can build their own resilience, and in which they can take initiative to be the change they want to see, as opposed to subvert and destroy what they find to be unacceptable around them.
No solution. We're not solution-minded. None of this.
So we're destructive. Absolutely. And that's a kind of Marxistic subversion, a type of discourse that is infiltrating our schools. All critical thinkers, the Frankfurt School, Marcuse, Horkheimer, Adorno, Gramsci, two of the more modern ones, Crenshaw, Butler, name them. What is that other woman who endorses pedophilia?
Gail Rubin?
Gail Rubin, that's it.
Rubin,
that's it. Yeah. To queer everything. In other words, as soon as something is established, whether it is adaptive or not, whether it follows good principle, the well-being of the majority, whether it leads to well-functioning societies, if it's established, it needs to be queered. And if identities and categories need to be queered, and childhood is one of those categories, childhood needs to be queered as well. And that is why we see something like minor attracted persons now, because it is too mean to consider certain people with potentially dangerous and harmful and destructive sexual proclivities to be called pedophiles. And since we're in the business of queering childhood, we also have this notion of adult attracted minors. So we assign adult sexual. Yes, think about that. We've crossed the Rubicon with the medical transition of children already,
Right.
and that has been the beginning of queering of childhood. Now, but to answer your question around critical therapy antidote, there's got to be an antidote. What would be the antidote? Well, first of all, you have to have your discourse right. What is your discourse? Do you have a common enemy discourse? Do you have a common humanity discourse? So you need to realize that even though the other is a destructive and envious, potentially even dangerous person, it is still a human. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have your boundaries clearly defined and that you should not defend those boundaries. And those boundaries, boundary management is one of the causes of clashes in modern society, because what the queering of society involves would be a violation of established boundaries of a large group. So they're out to instigate conflict by violating boundaries that many people hold dear and sacred. And these boundaries were not arrived at willy-nilly. These are boundaries that have stood the test of time over millennia across many, many cultures. And through this process of civil liberties, of communicating, of reflecting, the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, the freedom of conscience, the freedom of movement, etc., that we manage to make these necessary discoveries, and through discourse and through communication, we can come to a consensus to what will best serve society. A common humanity approach is necessary. A common humanity approach in which deliberation would be essential. And I know the ideologues of critical social justice do not want deliberation. They do not want communication. Yeah. They want a single narrative, and with that single narrative, they want to obliterate whatever does not fit their ideology. By the way, they don't create anything. They just destroy. And what they do create is ugly. Yeah. You can just remember the Sam Smith music video. Or you can think about that that sculpture that was made of Martin Luther King embracing his wife. I mean, it's such an ugly sculpture. Yeah. Of someone who really deserved better, Right?
Right.
Do not wait for the system to change, because then you'll be stuck in the anti all the time. Anti-woke. There's no stable identity in the anti. So we need to think about a post-woke environment, and we need to embody that post-woke environment. And under current conditions, it requires courage. And we need to speak out, because courage begets courage.
Well, that's the thing. So you've been talking quite about the queering of childhood. I get a lot of people who, I have to laugh because they call me homophobic. And I'm like, I'm not, okay. But they think that when you say that you are anti-queer, that you are anti-gay.
That's an old usage of the word queer.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, but there's so many people who really believe that, and they sit on this level, and I'm like, no, queering, the true term of queering, from what I understand, means to cripple, means to take something and bend it.
Right.
So we're bending our children's minds. And it doesn't have anything to do, I mean, yes, homosexuality can fit into that, but so can this racial narrative that children don't care.
Queering innocence.
Yes, which crippling it, taking it, and they call it the myth of innocence. I love the idea of post woke, because otherwise we're always on the defensive, right? We're always saying, well, that's not what we think, and we need to instead say, no, we've got the solutions. We have solutions, and the solutions are to not mutilate children. The solutions are the things that have worked for forever, and I'm just wondering where it is that people, again, going back to doctors, going back to professionals, we have such a lack of courage, and it seems like it happened instantly. What was the moment where it happened?
So there are many people who have broached this topic, and I think there are quite a few factors that have contributed to where we find ourselves currently. The development of our space of work. Now just hear me out. And this is the idea by psychologist Matthias Desmet of Belgium. And he has a book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And there he goes into quite some details to how our place of work has changed. Where in the past you used to have a trade. You used to produce something. It used to be a trade that would have been present in families for generations. But that was the nexus of your purpose. That gave you purpose. You directly saw what you produced. You saw the gratitude in someone's face who bought what you produced, or when you take it to the market to see the gratitude over there. And you could measure your prowess and your capability around this trade or this skill. In big corporations, you're just one small cog in a huge machine, and your sense of achievement is limited to KPIs and satisfaction of your boss. So that could strip a person of a sense of purpose. Okay, so that. The phasing out of Christianity is another reason. Because Christianity used to be, granted, not a perfect, but it used to be a map that worked well enough, a map that made the Enlightenment possible. And I know the Enlightenment in itself led to the decline of Christianity, but there's a reason why the Enlightenment took place in the Christian West and not in the Buddhist China. Right? There is a reason for that, and that has something to do with the open exploration of Christianity, the primacy of the individual, the appreciation and the curiosity of the appreciation of nature and the curiosity of it, of discovering God in nature. And with our discovering of God, we also discovered something like evolution, and that led to a few things. And eventually we realized, well, possibly there was something like a Big Bang, which doesn't necessarily require the existence of God to take place, etc. Still, it was within this realm that the Enlightenment and the scientific method and scientific discipline developed. It counts for something. Now Christianity is fading out. New generations do not have a reliable map. Previous generations that have grown up with Christianity and values, universal values, by the way, that have benefited them, they do not necessarily feel the loss of Christianity because they've internalized some of those values and they enact those values. But with new generations being born without that map, without the internalization of such values, we run into trouble. Another issue would be globalization. People are aware of different ways of thinking. And because there is no clear map in the West, there is a scrambling of maps by the encountering of different other maps. That also comes as the loss of a sense of purpose. Christianity does provide a sense of purpose. Whether you're Roman Catholic or Protestant, I'm way more familiar with a Protestant way of thinking. The idea of establishing the kingdom of earth gives you purpose in your current existence. And even if you die, there is a reward beyond death. People lack a sense of purpose these days. And what they're being bombarded with as something they need to strive towards is what they see on social media. And that is very narcissistic. So the promotion of the self, promotion of a fake self, what you put on display, that becomes the allure that people seek after in order to get a sense of meaning in their life. When you put all these things together, you see a major unmooring of society where people have lost the confidence in even believing the rudimentaries. And that is why we see that the people struggling the most with identity are also the people displaying the greatest identity crises. And that is therefore no secret, or it should come as no surprise, why we find this rapid onset gender dysphoria among people struggling with identity, namely adolescents. So this is a very, very difficult, complex, systemic crisis that we have on our hands. Critical social justice only aggravates it, only makes it worse. And we need to return to a map that is reliable and that has something to do with taking ownership and responsibility over your own life, as opposed to focusing on what is wrong around you and enviously, destructively acting out against those structures with the hope of somehow gaining a sense of purpose in destruction. We need to establish categories that work. We need prototypes again. And from those prototypes, we can tolerate variations within those prototypes. But we need prototypes to start with. And to stick to those prototypes, not to allow those prototypes to be queered.
So what I tell people is the only way that we save ourselves from this mess is to go backwards. We go back,
yes,
you know, for our young men, we need to give them, well, and our young women, but we need to give people hard work to do and a sense of accomplishment. We cannot cater to their every whim.
Yes, absolutely. These are people these are people who live in a virtual world, right?
Right.
In a virtual world, everything is possible until you meet reality.
Right.
You know, a virtual world is not going to stop your heart attack. If you've been spending night after night, not sleeping, eating pizzas and drinking fizzy drinks, playing online games, being unhealthy, and eventually dying from that. You know, the virtual world is entertaining, but it won't lead to your survival. And that a meetup with hard reality could also be, what shall I say? And this is something paradoxical. The meetup with hard reality could be just the thing society needs to pull them back into reestablishing their roots, rooted in reality again.
Yeah, I don't know how we survive it, and maybe you have a different view on this, but I feel like we're heading towards global communism. Just in terms of we're all supposed to think the same way. There are certain people who are creating the systems, and they're the same people funding the people at the bottom of that narcissistic, the activists, the ones who are destroying things. They're funding the ultimate capitalism, a place where they are in the very top, and they're the only way that we have production of anything. That seems to me the worst case scenario, and I don't know how we would get out of it, because in other situations with communism, people are out in 10 years. And historically, people have gone that sucked. How do we get out of this situation?
Hmm.
But you can't get out of that situation when it's digital, when
Right.
they have all that information. Is that
Yes,
how you see things going, or what is the
I'm a
worst
bit.
case scenario?
Well, that could be a worst case scenario. I am a bit more cautiously optimistic than that.
Okay.
I do think that the existence of alternative media could help us against the mainstream single narrative forming media houses that we see around us. I do think that people are not empty slates or blank slates that can just be programmed without the masses, the people using their own initiative and reflective abilities and intelligence to critically think about what is happening. Dictators die,
Yeah.
and these may be dictators from so-called, what shall we call them? What are they called these days? Philanthropists. From so-called philanthropists to statesmen and stateswomen. They die eventually. I think of certain countries that have had their experience in communism that would never return to communism again. Never as a long time, but not anytime soon, such as Eastern European states. And don't underestimate the power of the so-called Old Testament prophets of our time, who have their feet solidly on the ground, who speak the truth, and in whose whose ideas resonate with enough people that can make a difference, people that are productive and can take initiative, people who are not out to just dismantle and destroy, but people who would shoulder their yoke of personal responsibility and who would take initiative and dream and bring into reality a post-woke world. Do not underestimate those.
I so appreciate this conversation. Is there anything else? So your group is called Critical Therapy Antidote. You have a book and
Yes.
and your own podcast, correct?
Yes. So the book was released in the beginning of March. It is the book's title is Cynical Therapies: Perspectives on the Anti-Therapeutic Nature of Critical Social Justice. And it is a book that was compiled with the contribution of various authors addressing various critical social justice related topics, critically analyzing critical social justice claims. It is a fascinating book, and we're really excited about its release. And more or less the same time, we also launched our CTA podcast, our Critical Therapy Antidote podcast, myself and Christine Seethan. And we've been interviewing some of the authors of the book. And we're also looking forward to interviewing various other people.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for the courage that it takes. Have you had any kind of issues or like pushback against what you're doing yourself?
No, nothing yet. But we stick to the evidence. We stick to the established research. We know what we're talking about. We're critically reflective ourselves. We try to be as respectful as we can, and it is lovely to see more and more people starting to speak out, against what they see, and also starting to speak out for what they want to see. And that is a good time to live in. Yeah.
Right.